In the vast, frozen expanse of the Russian steppe. Distance is not measured in miles, but in time. In November 1942, for the 250,000 German soldiers trapped in the Stalingrad pocket, time was the one resource they had completely run out of. They were told to hold fast. They were told that the greatest military mind of the Third Reich was assembling a hammer of steel to smash through the Soviet encirclement and bring them home. But as they scanned the white horizon day after day, the only thing that arrived was the biting wind. If you want to understand the logistical nightmares that doom empires, make sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a deep dive into military history. To understand why the reinforcements arrived too late, we must first understand the shock of the entrapment. When the Soviets launched Operation Uranus on November 19th, they didn't just encircle a city, they shattered the psychological spine of the Wehrmacht. In 4 days, the Red Army punched through the Romanian flanks and met at Kalik, sealing the Sixth Army in a cauldron or kessel. The German High Command was paralyzed. Denial reigned in Berlin. Hitler, obsessed with holding the Volga, refused to allow General Paulus to break out while he still had the fuel to do so. Instead, he pointed to a map and created a new entity, Army Group Don. Field Marshal von Manstein, arguably the most brilliant operational strategist of the war, was given command. His orders were simple and impossible. Stabilize a collapsing front and cut a corridor through to Stalingrad to resupply and potentially extract the Sixth Army. On paper, it looked like a classic German counterstroke. The plan was codenamed Unternehmen Wintergewitter, Operation Winterstorm. But from the very first moment, the operation was fighting against the calendar. The reinforcements Manstein needed were not sitting idly nearby. They were scattered across occupied Europe. The 6th Panzer Division, the iron fist of the rescue force, was in France, enjoying the quiet life of occupation duty. They had to be loaded onto trains, shipped across the continent, re-equipped for winter warfare, and deployed into a combat zone where the rail lines were being blown up by partisans. Every day the trains chugged slowly east was a day the soldiers in Stalingrad ate less, shot less, and froze more. The friction of war was acting like a brake on the rescue. The German railway system was overwhelmed. The gauges of the Russian tracks had to be converted. Locomotives froze. The sheer distance meant that the fire brigade was traveling at the speed of a glacier, while the fire was raging out of control. By the time the assembly of forces began in early December, the Soviets had already spent weeks fortifying the outer ring of the encirclement. They dug in anti-tank guns, mined the roads, and moved their own fresh tank corps into position. The element of surprise, the hallmark of the blitzkrieg, was gone. The Germans were telegraphing their punch because there was only one feasible route to take, the railway line from Kotelnikovo. Manstein knew the odds were stacked against him. He looked at the strength reports of his relief force, the 57th Panzer Corps, and saw that it was woefully under strength. He was bringing a knife to a gunfight, but he also knew that 300,000 men were waiting for him. The order was given. The engines of the Tiger tanks roared to life. The rescue had begun, but the shadow of the clock was already stretching long across the snow. The reinforcements were moving, but the question haunting every officer was not, can we fight, but are we already too late? The engine of a Tiger tank is a beast of war, but even a Tiger struggles when the mud turns to concrete hard ice and the temperature drops to 30 degrees below zero. As the German relief force began its push towards Stalingrad, they weren't just fighting the Red Army. They were fighting the Russian winter itself. Before we join the crew of the 6th Panzer Division on their desperate drive, hit that like button to support our channel's mission to uncover the gritty reality of the Eastern Front. On December 12, 1942, Operation Winterstorm officially launched. The 6th Panzer Division, fresh from France and fully equipped, led the charge. Alongside them were the battered remnants of the 23rd Panzer Division and the 17th Panzer Division. Initially, the attack went well. The Germans caught the Soviet 51st Army off guard. The heavy Tiger tanks, making their combat debut in significant numbers, proved impervious to standard Soviet anti-tank fire. They smashed through the first line of defense, rolling over the frozen steppe with momentum that briefly rekindled hope. But late is a cumulative concept. The delay in launching the operation meant the weather had turned. A sudden thaw followed by a hard freeze turned the terrain into a nightmare. Then came the blizzards. Visibility dropped to zero. The Luftwaffe, which was supposed to provide air cover and blast a path for the tanks, was grounded. The panzer commanders were fighting blind. As they pushed north, the resistance stiffened. The Soviets, realizing the danger, poured reinforcements into the path of the German advance. The battle became a slugfest. This wasn't maneuver war. It was a battering ram hitting a wall. The German advance slowed from 20 miles a day to 10, then to 5. They were bleeding fuel and ammunition with every mile gained. Inside the Stalingrad pocket, the morale of the trapped soldiers soared when they heard the distant rumble of artillery. "Manstein is coming," was the whisper that went down the trenches. They started checking their watches, calculating the distance. They prepared their meager kit for the breakout. But they didn't know the reality of what was happening 40 miles away. They didn't know that Manstein's force was fighting for its life against superior numbers. The critical issue was the third factor. While Manstein was trying to punch a hole in, he needed Paulus to punch a hole out. The plan, Operation Thunderclap, called for the Sixth Army to abandon the city and attack south to meet the rescuers halfway. But Hitler forbade it. He demanded that Stalingrad be held and that a corridor be opened. It was a strategic impossibility. And because the relief force had arrived late, the Sixth Army was already too weak to move. Their horses had been eaten. Their fuel reserves were dry. The men were starving. If the rescue had arrived 2 weeks earlier, Paulus might have had the strength to launch a coordinated attack. Now, he was a spectator to his own rescue. Manstein sent urgent radio messages to Paulus. "Break out now." Paulus, bound by Hitler's orders and his own lack of fuel, dithered. The hesitation was fatal. The relief force was grinding itself down, wasting precious shells and men to buy time for a breakout. That wasn't happening. The reinforcements were there. They were fighting. But the synergy required for victory had been lost to the weeks of delay. The two German armies were reaching for each other's hands across the snow, but their fingers were slipping. There is a specific river in Russia called the Mishkova. It is a small, insignificant waterway, barely a line on a map. But in December 1942, it became the river Styx for the German army. It was a high water mark of the rescue attempt. The place where a phrase so near, yet so far, was written in blood. If you want to know what it feels like to see your salvation and watch it turn away, subscribe now and join our community of historians. By December 19th, the lead elements of the 6th Panzer Division had reached the banks of the Mishkova River. They were less than 30 miles from a perimeter of the Stalingrad pocket. At night, the tank crews could see the flares rising over the city. They could hear the heavy thud of the siege guns pounding the trapped army. They were tantalizingly close. Major General Erhard Rouse, commanding the 6th Panzer, later wrote about the frustration of his men. They were elite soldiers, fully capable of defeating the enemy in front of them, but they were exhausted. They had fought continuously for a week. They had crossed the Oksay River, fought to the village of Verkhneykamsky in a brutal 3-day tank battle, and now they stood on the last barrier. But the Soviets had used the time gifted to them by the German delays, to turn the Mishkova into a fortress. The Soviet Second Guards Army, a fresh formation that had been held in reserve, was deployed specifically to stop Manstein. These were not tired conscripts. They were well-equipped, motivated troops. They outnumbered the German relief force 3-1. Manstein played his final card. He sent a trusted intelligence officer, Major Eisman, into the pocket to convince Paulus to disobey Hitler and break out immediately. Eisman flew over the enemy lines, landed in the ruins, and confronted the gaunt, exhausted staff of the 6th Army. He painted a bleak picture. "The relief force is stuck. We cannot come any closer. You must move to us." Paulus looked at his fuel charts. He had enough gas to move his tanks 18 miles. The gap was 30 miles. Even if they broke the Soviet ring, they would run out of fuel in the open steppe, exposed to the merciless Russian winter and the Red Air Force. It was a suicide mission. Paulus, a man of staff maps and orders, could not bring himself to disobey Hitler for a gamble that looked like death. While the generals argued in bunkers, The soldiers on the Mishkova River fought and died. The 6th Panzer Division held the bridgehead against wave after wave of Soviet attacks. They were the tip of the spear, but the shaft of the spear was breaking. They were taking casualties they couldn't replace. Every tank lost was a tragedy. The tragedy of the delay was now fully realized. If the reinforcements had arrived 10 days earlier, the 2nd Guards Army wouldn't have been there. The gap would have been bridgeable. The 6th Army would have had the fuel. But history does not care about ifs. The reality was that the relief force had hit its culmination point. They were stopped not by a lack of courage, but by the immutable laws of logistics and time. They were standing on the balcony, looking at the burning house, unable to reach the door. While all eyes were fixed on the drama at the Mishkova River, a catastrophe was unfolding 100 miles to the northwest that would seal the fate of the rescue mission forever. In war, you often lose the battle in front of you because of a defeat behind you. This is the story of the Italian collapse and the death of hope. Don't forget to click subscribe to understand the interconnected web of strategy that decided the war. On December 16th, while Manstein was fighting his way towards Stalingrad, the Soviets launched a second massive offensive, Operation Little Saturn. This wasn't aimed at Manstein or Paulus. It was aimed at the Italian 8th Army, which was guarding the flank of the entire German southern front, far to the west of Stalingrad. The Italians were poorly equipped, lacking heavy anti-tank guns and winter clothing. When the Soviet armored steamroller hit them, the front disintegrated. Tens of thousands of Italian soldiers were overrun or forced into a chaotic retreat. This created a massive, gaping hole in the German lines. Through this hole, Soviet tank corps poured into the German rear, aiming for Rostov and the vital airfield supplying the relief force. Manstein, sitting in his headquarters, watched the red arrows on the map multiply. He faced a terrible dilemma, the kind that breaks commanders. If he continued to push north toward Stalingrad with the 6th Panzer Division, he might save the 6th Army. But in doing so, he would leave his own flank and rear completely exposed. The Soviet forces breaking through the Italian sector could sweep down and encircle not just the 6th Army, but Manstein's Army Group Don and Army Group A in the Caucasus. It would be a super Stalingrad, the total destruction of the entire southern wing of the Eastern Front. The decision was forced upon him. The reinforcements that were destined for Stalingrad had to be diverted. On December 23rd, the order came down. The 6th Panzer Division, the only unit strong enough to punch through to Paulus, was to disengage from the Mishkova River and rush west to plug the hole left by the Italians. For the soldiers of the 6th Panzer, it was a moment of profound bitterness. They were winning their local battles. They could see the glow of Stalingrad, and now they were being ordered to turn their backs on their comrades. They loaded their tanks onto flatbed trucks or drove them through the snow, moving away from the Kessel. Inside Stalingrad, the change was felt immediately. The distant rumble of the German guns stopped. The radio traffic died down. The hope that had sustained the trapped men for weeks evaporated instantly. They knew what it meant. The fire brigade was leaving to put out another fire. They were being abandoned. This was the ultimate consequence of the delay. Because the relief force arrived late, the Soviets had time to prepare not just a defense, but a counteroffensive elsewhere. The strategic initiative had passed to the Red Army. The Germans were dancing to Stalin's tune. The reinforcement arrived too late to dictate the battle. They arrived only in time to react to the enemy's moves. The departure of the 6th Panzer Division was the death knell of the 6th Army. The door was not just closed. It was bolted, barred, and buried under the snow. The retreat of the relief force was a somber affair, a funeral procession for an army that was still alive but effectively dead. As Manstein's tanks rolled west to save the rest of the front, the men inside the Stalingrad pocket began to starve in earnest. The failure of the reinforcements was not just a military defeat. It was a psychological trauma that would haunt Germany for generations. Before we analyze the final days, make sure you're subscribed to catch our upcoming breakdown of the surrender. Christmas 1942 in Stalingrad was a scene from Dante's Inferno. The temperature plummeted. Rations were reduced to a slice of bread and watery soup per day. Horses were dug up from the frozen ground and eaten raw. Cannibalism was whispered about. The Luftwaffe airlift, which Göring had promised to supply the army, was failing miserably. They needed 500 tons of supplies a day. They were getting barely 100. The soldiers knew the rescue had failed. They listened to the Christmas broadcast from Berlin, which played Silent Night and spoke of their heroism, but offered no hope of salvation. The bitterness was palpable. They felt betrayed, not by Manstein, perhaps, who had tried, but by the high command, by the distance, and by the promises of a quick victory that had turned into a long, freezing death. General Paulus sat in the basement of a Univermag department store, his headquarters. He had missed his window. The too late verdict was now absolute. Even if a corridor opened now, the men were too weak to walk. They were dying of typhus and dysentery. They were specters in rags. The Soviet ring tightened. Operation Ring, the final destruction of the pocket, began in January. The German soldiers fought on, not for Hitler, but for fear of Soviet captivity, which they knew meant death for most of them. They fought with the desperation of the doomed. The failure of the rescue mission also had a wider strategic implication. By sacrificing the Sixth Army, Manstein managed to stabilize the southern front. He used the time bought by the continued resistance of Stalingrad to pull Army Group A out of the Caucasus. If Paulus had surrendered earlier, or if the relief force had been encircled too, the disaster would have been total. In a cold calculus of war, the Sixth Army became a breakwater. They were the pawns sacrificed to save the Queen. But to the men freezing in the ruins, this strategic justification meant nothing. They only knew that the tanks they had prayed for had turned around. The narrative of too late became the defining story of the battle. It wasn't that Germany lacked the tanks or the men in total. It was that they couldn't get them to the right place at the right time. The tyranny of logistics had defeated the will to power. The image of the 6th Panzer Division turning away from the Mishkova River remains one of the most poignant symbols of the war, a turning point where the Wehrmacht ceased to be an unstoppable conqueror and became a desperate defender, fighting against the inevitable. When Field Marshal Paulus finally surrendered on January 31st, 1943, walking out his basement into blinding white snow, he was a broken man leading a ghost army. Of the nearly 300,000 men trapped, only 91,000 walked into captivity. Only 5,000 would ever return to Germany, and that would be more than a decade later. The failure of the reinforcements was total. But why exactly were they too late? If you want to learn the lessons history teaches us, subscribe and share this video. The reinforcements arrived too late because the German leadership was fighting a war fantasy, while the logistics officers were fighting a war reality. Hitler believed that will alone could move mountains. He delayed the formation of the relief force because he refused to admit the gravity of the situation until the trap was already shut. They were too late because the German railway system was fundamentally unsuited for a war of these distances. The broad gauge problem in Russia meant that every train had to be unloaded and reloaded or have its axles changed at the border, creating a bottleneck that strangled the operation. They were too late because the Wehrmacht was overstretched. You cannot conquer a continent and then expect to have a powerful reserve army sitting idle, waiting for an emergency. The reserves had to be pulled from France, leaving the West vulnerable, and the transit time was simply a matter of physics that no order from Berlin could change. And finally, they were too late because the enemy gets a vote. The Red Army of 1942 was not the Red Army of 1941. They had learned. They anticipated the relief attempt. They built defenses in depth. They launched counteroffensives on the flanks. They bought time with blood, just as the Germans did. The tragedy of Operation Winter Storm is that it was a technically brilliant operation executed in a strategic vacuum. The soldiers of the 6th Panzer Division performed miracles, but they were miracles in a graveyard. They proved that even the best tactical proficiency cannot overcome a strategic deficit of time and space. In the end, the silence that fell over Stalingrad in February 1943 was the silence of a grave. It was a monument to the fatal delay. It was a place where the German army learned that no matter how fast your tanks are, they cannot outrun the consequences of bad decisions. The reinforcements didn't just arrive too late to save the men. They arrived too late to save the myth of German invincibility. The war would drag on for 2 more bloody years, but the road to Berlin began the moment the rescue force turned back at the Mishkova River. Thank you for watching this deep dive into the tragedy of Stalingrad. If you want to understand the Soviet perspective and how Zhuka planned the trap, click the video on your screen now. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell for more history.